Let it go and wait until it does something. And if it moves, follow it. That's rule number 2. If it moves and starts doing something, pay attention to that and go with it and let it lead you, and you engage with it in whatever unfolds. If a story unfolds, or if a trip or a journey unfolds, you go along with it. And Jung said this is active imagination because you treat the image as though it were real. And you are actively present and engaged in this story. You aren't passive, so you don't do things in active imagination that you wouldn't do if it were real. It's real. Treat it as an intermediate space that is real. If nothing appears, after 20 minutes, go about your business and do your everyday stuff, and come back the next day and give yourself another 20 minutes. And keep doing this until an image appears. Now, Van Franz told a funny story about this. She said she had a patient and she told him, okay, it's time for you to start doing active imagination now. Okay, you're ready. So she gave him some instructions like this and sent him off. And the next week, and he said, I did exactly what you told me to. I sat there every day for 20 or 30 minutes. I saw absolutely nothing. Nothing appeared. So she said, well, just keep on doing. Just keep going back every day until something happens. After about 6 months of this, he came back in one day and said, I saw something. She said, great, what was it? He said, I was looking through a window, and outside I saw the profile of a goat. So she said, great, it started. Now stay with it. Go back every day and look at that goat and see if he moves. Does he do anything? So again he came back and he said, nothing happened. The goat just sits there. This went on for some months. And then she got a phone call in the middle of the night. And he was on the other end of the phone. He said, you've got to send me to the hospital. I'm going crazy. And she said, well, can you wait until the morning? I'll see you at 8 o'clock in the morning, give you the first hour. Okay, so he came in at 8 o'clock in the morning. And she said, what's the matter? He said, it moved. So it's beginning. It takes a while, and that's the beginning of active imagination. Sometimes it doesn't happen right away. And if you read the Red Book, you see that also when Jung begins, the first, I think, 15 days, he's in the desert. Nothing is happening. He's sitting there waiting for something to happen. And then he hears a voice. And it turns out to be the voice of the soul. It's a woman. A woman's voice comes from the distance somewhere. And all she says is, wait. And he says, I've been waiting already for 15 days. How long am I supposed to wait? She says, oh, you're so impatient. Wait. And then it starts. And then it gets going, and images appear, and stories develop, and you can tell when it's really taking off, so to speak, when it becomes really true active imagination, is when the figures develop their own life, autonomy. They show that they have their own will, their own voice, their own thoughts that are different from yours. And so this dialoguing with other parts of the personality that are invisible in the unconscious, this dialoguing with them becomes an essential part of weaving together the whole personality, of bringing in all these outside factors closer to consciousness so you can see them, you know they're there. There are your different parts. And for the people who did active imagination with Jung, in combination with their dreams, but active imagination, very important part, in the end they felt that it was fundamental to their coming into a sense of self that was much larger, much more complex, much deeper, and solid, like the stone, the lithos, the lapis. And also active imagination was very much used by Jung toward the end of analysis to facilitate termination. Because in order to overcome a dependency on a figure like Jung, a wise man, somebody you come and he has all the answers, you project great magical powers onto him. In order to free yourself from that, you need to find something in yourself that you can fall back on and rely on, because he's not going to be there anymore. Okay, this is termination time now. You have to become independent of him. So it was a way of facilitating an ongoing process in the patient that could continue after they left analysis. Many of the people who worked with Jung lived far away. They lived in America or other parts of Europe, and they might see him again in a year for a session or two, but in the meantime they had to continue working on their own. And this was also Jung's experience. When he broke with Freud, he lost his teacher, and he had a huge admiration, and we call it a transference, a religious transference. He told Freud in one letter, "I have a religious crush on you." Freud had this kind of magical genius about him that many people discovered and were drawn to. And so when Jung broke with him and they stopped their correspondence, never spoke to each other again, it was quite a bitter ending, Jung fell into a deep hole, into a nigredo state. And that's when he began his work that we see in the Red Book. And in that work, he found his teacher. Philemon was his teacher, an inner figure. So Philemon replaced Freud. Now Jung didn't need Freud anymore. He didn't need an external teacher. He had access to his own spiritual guide within, and that made him independent. And to my knowledge, Jung never had a transference to a great man again after that. And he met many great people, I mean, that the world recognized, but he'd gotten over that transference. He didn't need it because he had an inner teacher. And he could always consult Philemon or his inner guide if he needed some new directions. So that's what active imagination can produce, this inner-directed, inner-directed guidance rather than outer-directed. So in the end, basically, maybe learn to trust the self. And, you don't have to rely on other people's opinions, but you can listen to other people and you can relate to them. But in the end, you can make your own decisions based on inner guidance.
讲一个印象，我想听听 Murray 的意见。那我在想说今天在听炼金术的时候，如果说尤其在临床的心理治疗或精神分析的经验来看的时候，在炼金术的讨论好像是在从时间的面向来看的时候，透过炼金术的这些讨论，似乎让那个时间面向的一个过程讲得有更多细腻的描述。那也就是说，大部分来说，我们可能在心理治疗过去会讲说，这是一个 process， 但是这个 process 是什么？顶多我们也会讲移情还移情，但是好像更细腻的东西就很难去具体的讲。炼金术的语言好像在这种时间面向上可以描述得更细腻，但是我在想说，这是我的一个印象，有没有可能说，其实炼金术的在荣格心理精神分析或心理治疗里面，其实还有更大的，或者比等于说传统的心理治疗或弗洛伊德的精神分析，还有一个更不一样的领域在内，但是可能我完全没有抓到的，也有可能。
On your first point, I do think that these images and concepts from alchemy do provide tools for describing phenomena that we encounter in our psychotherapeutic work, and can be very useful for specifying stages or moods or feelings in the transference or in the relationship that unfolds. And on the second point, that there are aspects of alchemy that are not amenable to psychological interpretation. Yes, I'm sure there are. I'm sure there were alchemists who had experiences and made things and saw things that would be very puzzling to us and to our understanding. Because I think there also is a kind of quasi-scientific aspect to alchemy, that in this tradition there was a familiarity with their materials, with their various chemical compounds, and there was a development of knowledge that wasn't only on the psychological level, but was actually on a physical level, that they knew what they were doing with their materials and creating different products and compounds and chemical combinations. And I have no idea what Newton's work with alchemy was all about. I know a book has been written called Newton's Alchemy. Whether he was more interested in it as a spiritual process or as a physical, material process, I don't really know. But what Jung did was lift out the pieces that he could grasp and use for psychology, and he just left the rest alone. As I said, he wasn't really interested in the history of alchemy or in the material side of it. He was only interested in the symbolic that he could interpret from his psychological perspective. I have a friend, Stanton Marlin. He wrote this book, The Black Sun, The Alchemy and Art of Darkness. And he told me that he went to a convention of alchemists in Prague. And I think about the time he published this book in the mid-noughts, around 2005. He thought that they would be interested in Jung's ideas and that they would be also interested in the psychological aspects, but not at all. These were practicing alchemists. These were people who really believed that they could transform materials into something more valuable, into gold eventually. And so the whole psychological aspect was of no interest to them whatsoever, and he came away mystified at what they were about, but also fascinated that this is continuing in the modern world as a physical phenomenon. There's a website, I don't know if I showed it to you back here somewhere. There's a lot of alchemy website, yes. Top one, www.alchemywebsite.com. If you go to that, you'll find a lot of information about alchemy today. I mean, beautiful images, all the texts, all in color. I mean, Jung had no access whatsoever to anything like this. He had to make his own library, and now you can look it all up on the web and get information about what people are doing in this field today. One last story. When Jung was old, after the age of, he turned 80 in 1955, he had an 80th birthday. His health was not so good anymore. His wife died in the same year, and he was left alone, and he couldn't really get around. So he had a good friend of his, Fowler McCormick, from Chicago, who spent time in Switzerland with him and would drive him around the Swiss landscape. And one day on one of these trips, they went into a museum, and they were looking at the pictures, and a woman came up to him, and she said, "Aren't you Jung?" And she said, "You're Jung. I've read your books." And he was surprised because she looked like a simple woman, not an intellectual, not an academic, not a psychoanalyst. And he said, "Oh, you've read my books?" She said, "Oh, yes, but they are not books. They are bread." So she took his books as nourishment. She ate them. So she had this sense of the symbol, that the words that he put on paper were nourishment for the soul. And she didn't read them just from an intellectual point of view, but she read them for her own soul benefit. And I know many people who read Jung that way. They get down or depressed, they read Memories, Dreams, Reflections again, or read one of their favorite essays, and they reconnect to their own spiritual center, to their... He has that magical quality in his books. He says he writes with it's a double bottom in his works, as Van Franz said. They're like a suitcase with a double bottom. So you can read them on one level, but there's more underneath. And I had a conversation just last week in Tokyo with a friend of mine, Anne Casement. She's an analyst from London. And we were both on this panel at the Japanese Psychological Association, and she mentioned alchemy in her talk. Now, I know her quite well, and she's from the London school, Fordham, and the developmental side of Jungian psychoanalysis. And she's read widely and staged a conference recently on Jung and Lacan in Cambridge University. So after her talk, we had a little private conversation. I said, "Oh, I'm surprised you mentioned alchemy." And she said, "You know, a lot of these other texts in psychoanalysis get very old after you've read them once or twice, but alchemy, never. It doesn't get old. It doesn't wear out. You can read it many times." When I was a student at the Jung Institute many years ago, I asked a professor, "Will we be examined on alchemy? Do we have to study alchemy?" He said, "Oh, not in this training program. That's way too advanced." So I saved it for my later years, and now I read it quite a bit and I teach it. And I agree with Anne Casement. It doesn't get old. You can read it over and over again. You always get more out of it. So I thank you very much. I think we've finished our day and our seminar, and thank you for your attention.
公益督导公益课程，为心理咨询师及广大心理学爱好者做公益，我们是认真的。更多免费心理学课程，请关注微信公众号“心师之友”，或在微信公众号里搜索 XLZXSZY， 现在加关注就送心理学测评软件和神秘小礼品哦。